Similar to events in the United States, the 1960s were a time of social progress in the United Kingdom. Following World War II, large influxes of migrants from the empire's former colonies and some current territories flooded in looking for opportunity. At this time, predominantly Afro-Caribbeans who moved to the cities looking for employment. The rapidly changing demographic makeup of neighborhoods like London's Notting Hill created a newfound racial tension, spurring the creation of white supremacist gangs, including the neo-Nazi White Defense League. More broadly, the conservatism of the 1950s led to the creation of a British teen subculture known as the Teddy Boys, who could be compared to the phenomenon of greasers in the US, who tended to be white working class teens who enjoyed the in-your-face nature of the new up-and-coming rock and roll music and held a disdain for the integration of minorities into English culture. These tensions came to a head in 1958 with the Notting Hill riots that engulfed its namesake neighborhood. In August that year, a British-Swedish woman named Maj Britt Morrison got into a physical altercation with her Jamaican husband in public, sparking a gang of teddy boys to intervene and attack her husband. News of the incident spread, and it was used as an excuse to attack blacks in the neighborhood and damage their property. Ironically, it would be rock and blues music from the African Americans which would lead to a progressive change in attitude amongst British youth. Record label companies throughout the American South were finding immensely talented musicians and recording songs that should have been hits, but were not finding traction in the highly segregated American society. In an attempt to offload their records, these companies began selling them overseas and other English-speaking countries. The black music, which was largely being ignored in the States, became a smashing success in England, inspiring local teens to start their own bands, most prominently the Beatles, hailing from the industrial city of Liverpool. The Beatles first found widespread success in the UK, becoming an item of fancy for teenage girls and what became known as Beatlemania. Eventually, Beatlemania and rock and roll made their way to the US after being whitewashed. While Wilson made it clear that to cut costs, the empire would be exiting its untenable positions east of Suez, marking a visible decline in British hard power, British soft power in the form of music and pop culture was exploding. Another important event in the formation of Britain's civil rights movement was the Bristol bus boycott, where the city's new large black population organized a boycott of the city bus service due to their refusal to hire non-white employees, with the movement leading to the successful end of the discriminatory practice in 1963 due to widespread support from university students and left-leaning residents. These events led Prime Minister Harold Wilson to pass the Race Relations Act of 1965, which made it illegal to discriminate against individuals based on ethnicity, origin, or by the color of their skin. The law would later allow the government to prosecute white supremacist groups within the UK due to their inherent policy of discriminating against the introduction of black members. Interestingly, the law would also be levied against black Brits accused of harboring hatred against white people. The overlaps and similarities between the British and American civil rights movements continues with the existence of Black Power movements, with the British version of the Black Panthers being known as the Universal Colored People's Association, being led by Michael de Freitas, a Trinidad born resident of Notting Hill. Michael had moved to Notting Hill in 1957, where he found a job as a rent enforcer for the notorious Jewish slumlord Peter Rackman. There, he got involved with Black Power politics and changed his name to Michael X in honor of the leader of the American Black Power movement, Malcolm X. Michael X would be arrested in 1967 after giving an incendiary speech in Reading where he stated that white men have no soul, and he was sentenced to 12 months in prison. When he got out of prison, he moved to North London and purchased a residence he called the Black House, which would serve as a Black Power commune. His time in prison, spent in prison, had made Michael X bitter and increasingly more focused on his own personal enrichment over the greater advancement of Black Brits. In 1969, he invited Black businessman Marvin Brown to the commune and then proceeded to attack and imprison him in an effort to extort money from him, an attempt that failed. Michael X was arrested for the plot but was released after John Lennon, who was a well-known sympathizer, paid his bail. Michael X then fled back to Trinidad and Tobago, where he reestablished his Black Power commune. The commune would not last long, as in 1972, a former associate of Michael X's, Gail Benson, was murdered at the compound and buried in a shallow grave. Gail Benson was the white daughter of a conservative member of parliament who, in her own rebellion, became a socialite focused on the liberation of Black power. For a time, she was romantically involved with Michael X, but eventually entered a long-term relationship with his confidant Hakeem Jamal, entranced by his dedication to the following of Islam. Michael X had long been jealous that Benson had chosen Jamal over him, and this is what most likely led to the killing. Later, Michael X would burn down the compound to extract insurance money, inadvertently exposing the shallow grave and leading to his arrest. Michael X would go to trial and be found guilty of the murder of Gail Benson, and he was sentenced to execution by hanging in 1975. While the UK continued its of gradual decolonization on the African continent, the white-dominated southern Rhodesia refused to become independent under the terms of the British, which would mean giving Black citizens the right to vote. And in 1965, they unilaterally declared independence as an apartheid state. Wilson right away turned to the United Nations, which imposed harsh sanctions on the country. As part of this sanctions package, the British Navy would institute a blockade on the nation known as the Beira Patrol, which would last until 1975. However, Wilson declined to use military force to topple the regime. Race relations were not the only area that Wilson attempted to reform, and also in 1965, he passed the Murder Act of 1965, which abolished the death penalty and replaced it with mandatory life in prison, spare the crime of high treason. Additional forms of government revenue were opened with the establishment of two new taxes. In 1965, for the first time, capital gains would be taxed in the UK, which was in turn followed in 1967 with the selective employment tax, which taxed service industry businesses based on employee headcount, with manufacturing companies exempt as a way to try and maintain industrial growth. This progressive legislation would be followed by the Sexual Offenses Act of 1967, which legalized consensual homosexual acts so long as they were in private between individuals 21 or older. Also, that year, the Abortion Act legalized the practice up to the 28th week of pregnancy. The Theaters Act of 1968 ended the long-standing practice of government censorship over theatrical productions, which had originally been introduced by Prime Minister Robert Walpole all the way back in 1737 as a way to stop satirical productions being made that were critical of his administration. Finally, the Divorce Reform Act of 1969 provided a path for legal divorce after 2 years of separation without stated fault of either party. A major focus of Wilson's progressive reforms would be on expanding access to secondary education. The beginning of his administration saw the release of the Robbins Report, which reiterated the importance of a strong British system of higher education. The existing so-called 11 plus system of using placement exams to determine the academic and career trajectory of students was replaced with comprehensive schools, public schools which followed a more standardized curriculum for all, similar to the U.S. public school system. Wilson also founded the Open University, which is an alternative commuter school for older students located in Milton Keynes and is today the largest university in the UK by number of students. While the town of Milton Keynes was home to an old town in Bletchley Park and had long been populated, reforms of the 1960s transformed the town into a new age city that was heavily focused on the concepts of strict zoning and car-centric transport. This was part of a larger movement to revitalize and update the housing stock of dilapidated British cities. These efforts were often rushed and cheap and involved the rapid construction of apartment block towers, something more common to the US or Soviet Union. British skepticism towards living in high rises was confirmed in 1968 with the partial collapse of Ronan Point Tower in East London. In the early morning hours, a resident of the 18th floor had turned on her stove to make some tea, which caused a gas explosion and collapsed a corner of the building, killing four. The shoddy construction was to blame, and the incident inspired a series of progressive reforms aimed at increasing the safety of residential towers. However, a long-standing aversion to living in high rises persisted in the British public following the accident. The collapse followed the similar disaster just a few years earlier in what is known as the Aberfan disaster. In October 1966, heavy rains caused byproduct materials from coal mining called colliery that had been stored on the mountainside surrounding the Welsh village of Aberfan in mounds known as spoil tips to collapse, causing a large landslide that ended up killing 144 civilians, including 116 children. At the time, Queen Elizabeth II was heavily criticized for not visiting the devastated community until 8 days after the disaster. Following the disaster, a parliamentary Aberfan disaster tribunal was set up to investigate the collapse, with the inquiry leading to the blame being placed on the National Coal Board and a group of its employees who flouted safety protocols. The event would lead to Wilson passing the TIPS Act of 1969, which banned the practice of the piling up of coal or colliery into tips as a means of storage. Additionally, Wilson would streamline the welfare system by combining the various departments handling Social Security, coupled with large increases in average pension amounts paid and an abolition of charges on prescriptions purchased through the NHS. Another group within British society which had used the 1960s as a decade to strive for an end to discrimination were the Irish Catholics of Northern Ireland. Their struggle for equality came to a boiling point in 1969 when Irish residents of the Bogside neighborhood in Derry clashed with a rowdy mob of young Protestant men known as the Apprentice Boys, who were doing their annual provocative anti-Catholic march through town. This sparked an out of control 3 day riot, resulting in hundreds of injuries. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force of Northern Ireland, were unable to quell the violence, and regular officers and they dispatched their paramilitary division, the Ulster Special Constabulary, also known as the B Specials, to deal with the Irish protesters with a heavy hand. The escalating violence from both sides concerned Wilson, and he made the difficult decision to launch Operation Banner, which saw the deployment of 21,000 British soldiers to Northern Ireland to attempt to maintain peace through occupation, beginning the era of violence in the region known as the Troubles. As part of the deployment, the British agreed to dismantle the B Specials and replace them with the reformed Ulster Defence Regiment, which would be partially integrated with British forces in an attempt to maintain good behavior, although the success of this was limited. The 60s had also been a time of confrontation with the labor industry, and a series of strikes began to weigh on the popularity of Wilson's administration. A white paper was written up called In Place of Strife, which was proposed introducing regulations to remove the power of labor unions. But the controversial memo caused friction within the administration, and its contents were leaked, causing outrage among factory workers, tanking its viability. This blunder, along with a sluggish economy, led to Wilson being defeated in 1970, being followed by conservative Edward Heath. Heath quickly began his campaign of austerity by cutting a myriad of welfare benefits, most controversial being the ending of the practice of offering free milk as part of a public school lunch. Along with the austerity, Heath did pass substantial reforms to the welfare system, including the Family Fund, which was a government-ran charity which would raise money for families with sick or disabled children to help them pay their medical bills. Then there was the attendance allowance, which was a new Social Security benefit offered to disabled elderly citizens that provided government-sponsored at-home care for individuals who would otherwise be required to go into a nursing facility. The invalidity, excuse me, can't say that word, invalidity benefit provided a welfare payment to those who lost their jobs following injury or long-term illness. Lastly, the family income supplement would provide poor working families with up to £4 per week to help cover expenses. Confoundingly, until 1971, British money had no decimals and instead relied on a set system of exchange between different coins and bills. In a major push for modernization, on February 15th of that year, Heath declared Decimal Day, which would officially bring decimals into use in currency and education. That same month, Heath created the Central Policy Review Staff, which would operate as a think tank within his cabinet that would recommend the best course of future reforms. Some of the most prominent of these reforms would include the Industrial Relations Act of 1971, which aimed to rein in the power of unions by mandating that bargaining power only rests with union leadership and that any strike not authorized by leadership that does not go through the legal process is illegal, something which greatly angered union members. The Local Government Act of 1972 simplified the county system, reducing the number of local governing councils from 1,245 to just 412. Finally, the European Communities Act of 1975 approved the UK's admission to the European Economic Community, something that had long been in the pipeline. Heath's treatment of union members came back to haunt him in 1973 when the National Union of Mine Workers went on a nationwide strike, leading Heath to declare a national emergency in which people would be permitted to work only 3 days of the week in order to conserve electricity. Heath's most difficult challenge as a prime minister, however, would be on how to handle the ever unraveling situation in Northern Ireland. In 1970, as part of the British Army's occupation, a large operation was carried out to search and seize illegal weapons stashed away in Belfast by IRA members. The operation turned violent, and the military instituted a 34-hour curfew known as the Falls Curfew, where no residents were allowed to come and go from the neighborhood, ultimately only being ended by a large group of women and children from surrounding towns who marched on Belfast with food and water. The following year, the Army launched Operation Demetrius, where soldiers captured and interned without trial 1,981 suspected IRA members on charges of terrorism. During this operation, a parachute regiment operating in Belfast opened fire on Irish Catholics after claiming to have been shot at, killing 11 in what is known as the Ballymurphy Massacre. This event would be eclipsed by the much more famous Bloody Sunday of 1972, where British Army officers fired onto a large crowd of Irish protesters in Derry, killing 14. At the onset of the Troubles, the IRA splintered into two rival factions. The official IRA, which had the goal of unifying Ireland under one socialist republic, and the Provisional IRA, also known as the Provos, who were made up of a more right-leaning IRA members who rejected the idea of socialist republic and also believed in an increase in militarism in order to end British rule. 2 days after Bloody Sunday, an arson attack was carried out on the British embassy in Dublin, burning it down, and more broadly, support for the Provos, who had previously been seen as a fringe group, was increasing among the Irish public. This newfound support showed itself with the advent of no-go areas, which were portions of Belfast and other British occupied cities which had so many hostile residents inside, the British Army were effectively unable to enter. In 1972, Operation Motorman was carried out, which saw the British Army raid and dismantle all of the no-go areas across Northern Ireland. To try and quell the violence, Heath proposed and signed the Sunningdale Agreement, which established a short-lived body called the Executive of the 1974 Ireland Assembly, which would attempt to institute a system of power sharing between British and Irish governing bodies. The general feeling of a loss of control over Northern Ireland led to the downfall of Heath's government in 1974, with him being once again followed by Labour's Harold Wilson.